anybody ever grown asparagus in your garden? Okay, quite a few. What about garlic? All right, just a couple. Great. So these are both really rewarding plants to grow, and they're also really fun because they don't follow the same season as other vegetables. It's not something that we plant in May and then harvest in August. They're both different than that. So it's something nice to vary your season if you're really, like me, anxious to get out to the garden right now. Asparagus is something that we start planting and harvesting before a lot of other things. So I'm going to talk about the basics of asparagus, how to select a site and prepare a site to plant an asparagus patch or expand your asparagus patch if you already have one. I'm going to talk about the suggested varieties for Minnesota, and then I'll talk about what to do in the planting year. And then I'm going to take any questions on asparagus, and then we'll go to garlic for a few minutes. Asparagus is a crop that lives for 15 or more years. So this means that when you pick a place to plant your asparagus, it takes a commitment, right? It's a long-term commitment. It has to be a really nice site for that because it's not something you're going to want to move after a few years. We plant that in April or May, basically as soon as the ground is workable and it's not too cold and wet. And then that first year of asparagus is dedicated to just helping the plants develop. We don't harvest anything in the first year. Just foster that good root system and plant growth. And then we start harvesting a little bit in the second year, a year after you plant. The season for asparagus is about May to June, so it's only a 6 to 8 week time frame, which means you could be harvesting a lot in that 6 to 8 week time frame. And there are different ways you can preserve asparagus, whether you blanch it and freeze it, or you pickle it to help you have asparagus all year round. Now, the next bullet, I say yields range from 2,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre every year. I give this presentation a lot to farmers who are looking to plant an acre or more of asparagus. So if you scale that down to, let's say, just a fifth of an acre, you might be getting a couple 100 pounds of asparagus every year. So depending on what your goals are, you might be able to just plant, one row of asparagus in your garden, and you'll have plenty for what you need for the year. But if you're planning on selling to a farmer's market, we recommend having at least a fifth of an acre of asparagus in order to keep a steady supply from week to week during the farmer's market season. Asparagus is nice because it's extremely salt tolerant, so it can survive lots of different soil types. So here's some reasons why I think it's a great idea to grow asparagus. If you do sell for farmers markets, this is an early market crop. If you're somebody who's just planting asparagus to eat and give to your friends, it's something we can get early in the season when we're all eager to get outside. It's if you are selling it, it's relatively high value, and there's a lot of demand for asparagus right now in Minnesota that's not being tapped. A lot of our asparagus in Minnesota actually comes from Michigan. So there's a lot more potential, and it grows really well here. It has a single planting time, which is nice. You don't have to plant it every year, and it has numerous soil health benefits. There's a lot of evidence in the past 20 years or so that reducing the number of times we till our garden or field is a lot better for the soil because it supports a healthy soil structure and microbes in the field that are necessary for healthy plant growth. Asparagus is a crop that we don't really have to till very often, if at all. So it has some opportunities for really increasing soil health in our gardens. So asparagus starts out as these small green seeds here. They're just about 1 millimeter each. And if you were to grow up asparagus seeds individually, you would have these tiny little asparagus plants. Those plants develop these root systems. This is about a foot long root here, very thick roots, and this is called a crown. So when you buy and plant asparagus, you're typically not going to be planting it from seed. You typically want to plant it from a crown because it's already had a year to grow and it's going to be able to establish in your garden a lot faster than if you were going to plant it from seed. So it'll grow up in that first year and basically grow a lot of ferns. So something like this with a lot of healthy big spears growing out of the ground, that's what it'll look like in about the first to second year. As many of you know, those spears will then grow into large ferns. So that signals the end of asparagus season. After about 6 to 8 weeks, you stop harvesting your asparagus, harvest everything you want, and then just let those ferns grow. That's what helps the plant maintain a healthy root system and be productive next year. This is what the crowns or the root system looks like. So if you order asparagus from one of our suppliers, which I'll show you later, this is what will come in the box. That's what the crown looks like. And so that root system will get anywhere from 6 to 10 feet deep or long in the soil, depending on how deep your soil is. But those are really vigorous root systems. However, it's important to note that most of the roots that are actually taking up the nutrients from the soil that asparagus needs to grow, those are all located in the first 6 inches of the soil. So it's important to keep some really fertile soil in that top 6 inches with lots of nutrients, and to make sure your bed is well weeded so that weeds aren't competing for those valuable nutrients, because they're not getting their nutrients from the deeper soil typically. So I mentioned the value of reducing the amount of times we till in a garden. And with a lot of our annual vegetables like tomatoes, peas, and beans, we end up tilling vegetable gardens quite a lot. Most people till their garden in the spring, and then many people will till it again in the middle of the summer and maybe at the end of the summer too. What that does over time is it breaks down the structure of the soil and it makes it a harder, more compact soil that plants have difficulty growing in. If you can find a way to reduce the amount of tillage in your garden, that's going to be a really good thing for your soil structure. So with asparagus, this is a crop where we really don't have to till the garden very much at all. Some people do, but it's really, in a lot of cases, not necessary to do so. So it creates a habitat for pollinators. If we're not tilling the ground all the time, there are a lot of pollinators that have to burrow into the soil in order to survive from year to year. So if we're not tilling, like an asparagus system, it allows that habitat for those pollinators to live. It supports soil microbes because we're not disturbing those soil microbes over and over again. And not tilling means that we are protected against erosion because that soil structure is maintained and it's not as susceptible to washing away every year with rain. Those deep root systems also hold that soil together really nicely. Asparagus is also something that gives us opportunities for cover crops. I'm going to go into that later. But it's really relatively easy to plant a cover crop or like a clover grass cover in the middle between your rows of asparagus. And that allows us a lot of opportunities like weed management, because cover crops compete with weeds. Or it will allow us more habitat for those important pollinators. So cover crops have a lot of opportunities as well. And then by planting something like asparagus with a cover crop or something else in between those rows, we have opportunities for intercropping or increasing our crop diversity in the garden. The ideal site for asparagus is well-drained soil. It also does well in pretty sandy soil. So if some gardeners out here have sandy soil, this is a good candidate for that. It just basically likes something where it can spread freely through the soil, and that'll help you get a larger asparagus patch faster. It likes to have a good amount of organic matter too, especially if you don't have a sandy soil. Let's say you have a clay loam soil. Adding organic matter to that is going to be important. Heavier soil can sometimes work for asparagus just fine, but it doesn't like to have its roots wet. So if we have a really wet summer where there's a lot of rainfall events, it's important that your soil drains well and you don't have sitting water in your asparagus patch. Access to irrigation, that's more relevant for larger farms. On a garden, you don't really need to have irrigation in your asparagus patch. Having a windbreak is a good idea because there are certain diseases that blow onto asparagus and damage the spears, so having trees around as a windbreak is a good idea. And then being able to go out there every day, or at least every other day in May to June to harvest asparagus is helpful as well. We get more tender spears when we're actually out there harvesting every day, as opposed to letting those spears grow for several days before harvesting. I would avoid planting in a foggy valley or an area where water pools when it rains. All right, so I'm going to talk about how to prepare soil for an asparagus patch. And if you already have an existing garden where you're going to plant asparagus, you might already have perfect conditions and you might not need to do much of any preparation at all. But we have a lot of people who want to expand their asparagus patch. And so what you would do is you would want to, in that case, if it's ground that's been used as a lawn or for something else for a while, you would want to make sure you, in the year before you plant, add organic matter to that. Get a soil test to see if your soil has the nutrients that asparagus needs. And you want to have a pH level between about 6.5 and 7. So it's a good idea to just do a soil test to make sure pH level isn't really high or really low. If you already have an existing garden and your plants are growing fine, like a lot of your annual vegetables are growing fine, then there's a good chance that your pH is already in that safe range. Another thing to do in the first year is minimize the amount of weeds that you have in the garden, especially things like thistles and quietgrass, because once the asparagus is planted, it's really hard to get those weeds out from between the spears. All right, so again, this is just a list of those tests. Soil test is the first thing that's really important. If you haven't done a soil test before, it's easy to get one from the university, and it's really cheap. It's about $17 to $25 to do a soil test in your garden or in your field. Adding compost and manure might be a good idea depending on how your soil is, but when you do your soil test, it'll tell you how much organic matter is already in your soil. So you might find out that you don't need to add as much as you think you might. And then it'll allow you to put in fertilizer depending on what that soil test says. Eliminating perennial weeds, as I said before, and then breaking up compacted soil is important as well. If you're tearing up a new piece of yard to put asparagus in, you can plant a cover crop in that area to break up the soil. Something like a tillage radish, it has a really thick root that breaks through compacted soil. Great idea. Adding compost is a good idea as well. Now, if you want to plant asparagus this year, and you don't want to have to spend a year just preparing the area you want to plant it, in some cases that's okay. As I said before, if your garden is already in really good shape, you might not need to prepare it for a year beforehand. But if you plant this year, that means that you're basically going to be planting as soon as the soil warms up and dries out this season. So if you do that, you won't have time to do a soil test before you need to plant. You won't be able to do a whole lot of weed control, like tillage or soil irrigation, which is the method where we put down plastic to snuff out weeds. You won't really have a chance to do much of that. You won't really have a chance to change the pH of the soil if you need to, and so this could result in problems later on. But if you think that your garden plot already fits those criteria that we talked about, then you could be safe to go ahead and buy asparagus this year. All right, so I'm going to review a little bit of how to interpret a soil test and how to figure out if your soil is a good site for asparagus or if you need to amend it. So these are some of the nutrients here that are important for asparagus, and then organic matter and pH as well. And these are all things that you can get when you take a soil test. So this is the name of our soil testing lab at the university, and this is a link to find information on that soil testing lab. But if you're online and you just search University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab, you'll find it there. This is an example of what a soil test report can look like. And has anyone ever taken a soil test in here? Okay, some people in the back. So when you take a soil test, and I would recommend this for any vegetable in your garden, what you're going to do is go around your garden with a trowel, and you take a bucket too, and you take 5 trowelfuls of soil, about 6 inches deep, and you dump those in a bucket together. And you're going to mix them around in the bucket, and then that's your soil sample. Out of that sample, you just take about a pint's worth of soil, let's say a cottage cheese container or something like that, close that up, and then you put that in a box and send it to the soil testing lab. And it goes along with a form, and you'll find that form when you go online. So this is a soil test report. If you send a soil sample, this is the kind of report that you're going to get back. And when we look at it, it looks like a lot, but it's actually not too intimidating once we go through it for a second. So this is a soil test that someone sent me from their vegetable farm that he took last summer. So what we have here is it's telling us what the organic matter of the soil is, which is right here on the left. The zero pointer is at 6.9% organic matter. That's really high, so that's good. We've got a pH of 7.6, so it's a little higher than asparagus wants, but it's typically going to be okay. And then it tells us our levels of phosphorus and potassium. So phosphorus and potassium are 2 nutrients that are really, really important for asparagus. When people plant asparagus, they typically put potassium and phosphorus in the row with it. So these are important. So let's see. Do we have enough phosphorus to plant potassium, or do we need to fertilize? It says it has about, it's at that number like 12 or so for phosphorus. That's 12 parts per million. All right, so I want to find out if that's enough for asparagus or if I need to fertilize. This is our recommendation for how much phosphorus asparagus needs. So if we think back to our report, it said we had 12 parts per million of phosphorus. If I go down here, 12 would be between 11 and 20. So if I have 12 parts per million, it's telling me that I need to put on 150 pounds per acre of phosphorus. Now that's a lot per acre, but if you're just thinking about one row of asparagus in your garden, all that's saying basically is you need to sprinkle a little bit of phosphorus fertilizer on your garden in order to have a good asparagus patch. All right, but this soil test report is telling us we have very, very high levels of potassium. The K is all the way up to the very high level. So I don't really need to add any phosphorus. It said it had 225 pounds of potassium in that soil, and that's all the way up here. So if I have over 225 already, I don't need to add any potassium to my soil. We're already good. All right, so I'm going to talk about ordering and planting asparagus. Asparagus is planted in a really unique way that we don't plant many of our other vegetables at all. So it actually gets planted in trenches like this, about 8 inches under the surface of the soil. There are 3 methods for planting asparagus, but the one I focus on is crowns, because typically I recommend that people buy crowns. You don't buy seeds or plants when you're planting asparagus. Again, this is what a crown looks like when you order it. And I recommend ordering asparagus the winter before you're going to plant. So if anyone wanted to plant asparagus this year, I would go ahead and order soon, because the asparagus companies are telling me they're almost out for this year, but you can still get them. And you would choose your ship date. They ask you, when do you want it shipped? And you should choose a mid to late April date to have that shipped, because you don't want your asparagus sitting around too long after it comes before you plant it. These are 4 places you can go to actually order asparagus online. This first one, Ag Resources, is a company out of Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. So we really like supporting them. It's a local Minnesota business that helps out a lot of vegetable farmers in our area. But if they don't have varieties that you want, you can also look at these 3 other farms. 2 of them are in Michigan and 1 of them is in Maine. And these all 4 are very good places to order asparagus. If you want, let's say, about a 20-foot row of asparagus in your garden, I would recommend getting about 25 asparagus crowns. So I'm going to talk about varieties first, though. So varieties of asparagus come in either hybrid or open pollinated. And what that means is the open pollinated varieties are usually older varieties, whereas the hybrids are newer. And there's pros and cons to each of them. A lot of the hybrids are all male, quote unquote. And what this means is there are no seeds produced by the asparagus plants after they're in the ground. The reason why that's a good thing is if the seeds are produced by the asparagus fern, they're going to fall on the ground and come up as volunteer asparagus where you don't want it. So, unless you do want it. But we typically recommend getting all male hybrids. And then choosing hardy varieties that can survive in our Minnesota winters is important too. All right, so open pollinated varieties. Why might you choose one of those over the other? And when you order them, they'll say whether they're open pollinated or not in catalogs. These are a lot less expensive than our hybrid varieties. We know that they have good winter hardiness. Our varieties are really well understood too, because they've been planted for a long time. But because they're very well understood, we know that they typically have lower yields than a lot of our other hybrid varieties. The stalks are less uniform, so sometimes you'll get a spear that's really, really thin, like a pencil, and sometimes you'll get a very thick one, like a quarter. There's less disease control in them. They're not as resistant to some of our diseases, and they take longer to get to production. So a lot of breeders have bred new varieties or hybrid varieties of asparagus to be better about some of those challenges of the open pollinated varieties. Hybrids have yields that are 2 to 4 times higher. They have more even spear size. They're faster to produce. They have more disease tolerance, and usually they're all male, so you won't have to worry about that reseeding issue that I talked about. But they are a higher seed cost, or higher crown cost, definitely. They're not as long-lived, so some of those open pollinated varieties, they can live, 20, 25 years, whereas a hybrid variety, you're looking at about 15 years in your soil. And they are more prone to winter damage in the far north part of the state. But most of any of the varieties that I'm going to talk about today should do just fine in this area. So here's a list of the varieties that are available to us in Minnesota and can be hardy here. You can see our open pollinated varieties. They're called the Washington series. So we've got Mary Washington and Martha Washington. And then there's one called Viking. There's one called Green Giant. And then there's Purple Passion, which is, of course, the purple asparagus. It's really pretty if you eat it fresh. If you boil it, it will just turn green like any other asparagus, or like purple beans do that as well. There are 4 hybrid varieties that we recommend in Minnesota. There's 3 that are part of this quote-unquote Jersey series. They all grow really well. And then there's a very new one called Millennium. We don't know as much about Millennium because we haven't been growing it for as long. But we know that the Jersey varieties do really well in Minnesota. So you might wonder which varieties actually yield the most asparagus and are most productive. So there was a little study done a few years ago, back in 2013, by the university that compared different varieties of asparagus. We don't do a lot of trials on asparagus because you have to harvest it every day, and a lot of us don't have time to be out there every day harvesting it. But we're glad that they did this study in 2013. So let's see, what we want to know here is how many pounds can this asparagus produce. So here they were looking at plots. So I'm not sure how big their plots were, but we'll just look at these numbers relatively. Higher numbers were bigger yields. So Millennium yielded the highest amount of pounds of asparagus. And then the Jersey varieties, Jersey Giant and Jersey 9, did pretty well too. Purple Passion was down here, so Purple Passion doesn't yield quite as well as some of our green hybrid varieties. But if you're looking for a purple asparagus, you probably don't mind. Mary Washington, which was, again, that open pollinated variety, as you can see here, it's 1.8 pounds per plot versus the Millennium, which was 4.8 pounds per plot. So with Mary Washington, that open pollinated variety, you're not going to get as high of yields. When you get crowns in the mail, which they'll come in a cardboard box, the first thing you want to do is check and make sure that they're healthy. And the crowns should look like this. They should have nice, white, thick roots. When you press them, they shouldn't be wrinkly. They should just be really nice and plump. And when you look inside that root, you can just cut one open and see. It should be white inside. If you order asparagus crowns and you cut one open and they're brown inside, that could mean that it has a disease that will then stay in your soil for a very long time. So just make sure that they're nice and white inside. If they're not, you can take a picture of that and you can send it back to the company and ask for new crowns. When we plant asparagus, they're planted in furrows. This is a really unique system from a lot of our other vegetables, except for maybe potatoes. So what you'll do is when you go out to the garden to prepare the soil, you can just take a shovel and actually shovel a row about 8 inches deep. Make sure you just gently pile that soil right next to the trench that you just dug, because throughout the season, you're then going to fill that trench back in with that soil that you took out. So don't throw it over the grass, just set it right next to the trench. So it'll look something, like this illustration on the left. This says 6 to 8 inches deep for your trench, but I would recommend definitely going on the more 8-inch range. 6 inches is not going to end up being enough because when it rains, some of that soil that you dug out is going to go back into that trench, and the 6-inch trench that you dug is suddenly going to be a 2-inch trench. So I would really dig deeper. Deeper is better. So if you do multiple rows of asparagus, make sure they're about 3 to 4 feet apart at least, and that allows space for you to walk in between the rows and for the asparagus ferns to spread. So this is what one might look like if you just do one row there. You can see it's kind of in a trench. And this is what that trench looks like on a much, much larger field. This was about a 500-acre field of asparagus, but it still gets the point across that that's what your trench is going to look like. And then they planted the asparagus crowns right down the middle of the trench. So let's say you decided to dig more of a 5-inch trench, or that's all you could get to with the equipment you had. What's going to happen is the asparagus will still grow, it'll be okay, but you'll have kind of thinner spears. They'll also be more susceptible to frost because those roots are going to be closer to the soil surface, and they'll be susceptible to frost in the spring that way. But you'll also get an earlier harvest if you plant more shallow. But I still recommend planting deeper. If you have a heavier soil, you can plant shallower, but if you have a sandy soil, you should be planting about 8 inches deep. When you plant asparagus, crowns should be spaced about 12 inches apart. So when you get that crown, you'll just lay that down flat in the row, and some people prefer to kind of spread out those roots a little bit like an octopus. That's fine too. Either way will work. So the 12 inches, they were using a trowel to mark 12 inches. So a lot of people like to put phosphorus, fertilizer, or compost in the bottom of the trench when they plant asparagus. That's because it takes a lot of phosphorus for asparagus to establish. So if you go to the garden center and you look for a fertilizer that has a lot of phosphorus in it, you can just ask or you can look at the package. That's a good idea to sprinkle some of that in beforehand, or put compost. The challenge with compost is you don't know how much nutrient is actually in compost. So then what you'll do once you have them planted, you can see our trowel here is being covered up. You're just going to brush over some of that soil that you had set to the side. You just want to put about 1 to 2 inches of that soil over the asparagus at that point when you plant it. Leave the rest to the side. And then as the asparagus grows, you'll see the ferns starting to poke up through that soil. When you see the ferns starting to poke up, it'll take about 3 or 4 weeks for that to happen. That's when you go through again. That'll be maybe June or July at that point, and then brush more soil on the top of it. You'll do that about 3 to 4 times during the season until there's no pile anymore and there's no trench. The soil's just level. Yeah, so just fill gradually throughout the season. And this is a picture, it's a little blurry on here, sorry, but this is what it'll look like once you have completely filled your furrow in. It's level with the rest of the ground, and then, again, we're not harvesting in that planting year at all. You'll just see those spears start growing up and developing ferns on the top. All right, so watering is important in the first year, and you probably don't need to water your asparagus at all after the first year. Weed management is really important after you plant, and this can be challenging because we can't go in there and cultivate. You can't really hoe too much because we're going to damage those roots that are trying to come up. And so it's a lot of hand pulling. If you've heard of a flame weeder before, some people have flame weeders, you can actually use that to kill the weeds that are on the sides of the rows. And you can hoe in between the rows, but not in the rows. So again, it's just a lot of hand weeding there. Some people like to use mulch, and mulch is okay once the ferns have actually started coming out of the ground. But while the roots are still trying to establish and you haven't seen ferns come up yet, I wouldn't recommend using mulch. Only use it once they're up. So that was the planting year. And then after the first planting year, so a year after you plant, that's when you can go ahead and start harvesting. 1 year after you plant asparagus, you could harvest for about 1 week to 2 weeks. But I wouldn't harvest any more than that because the plants are still so young that they need that time to establish their root system. And every time we cut off the spears, that's basically the stem of the plant, setting it back. So 2 years after you plant, that's when you can start doing full harvest of about 6 weeks. If you see that your asparagus isn't very vigorous, you might just want to be more conservative on the amount that you harvest. It's a better idea in the long term, if you don't think your asparagus is doing very well, to harvest less rather than more. Give that asparagus a chance to really rejuvenate itself by not harvesting too much. So then harvest is done basically by either cutting the asparagus about 1 inch above the ground, or some people on commercial farms will use kind of a pruning shear to go a couple inches below the soil. They'll actually cut the spears below the surface of the soil, and they're white under there. So if you buy asparagus at the store and the ends are white, that's why. They harvested it below the soil. And there's no huge advantage of doing this. So for a garden scale, I would recommend just using regular scissors or pruning shears to just cut it at the level of the soil. You don't need to worry about going below. Harvest about every day, every 2 days at the very least. And the reason we do this is that the spears should be about 6 to 8 inches, maybe 12 inches tops when you harvest them. You don't want to let asparagus sit out there for too long, because if it sits in the field for a long time, it becomes kind of fibrous. And when you buy asparagus at the store and it's really hard to chew through, that means it's been sitting out in the field too long. So harvesting more rather than less is a good idea. If the soil is more fertile, your spears will grow quicker, and it'll help you harvest more rather than less. So harvest should be done by the end of June. It's typically July 1st that a lot of our farmers decide to stop harvesting asparagus for the year, and then they'll just let the ferns grow. After harvest, what they'll do is completely take out all the spears that are currently growing, and then if you think you need to fertilize, let's say that the plants didn't do very well, or maybe you're seeing some ferns come up that are kind of yellow, and you want to fertilize, you can go ahead and do that after all the spears have been harvested. If you do harvest your spears below the soil surface, then that means that you could actually use a rake or a hoe to lightly incorporate a little bit of compost on the top. And then you'll just let the ferns grow like that. In the fall, remove the ferns. We typically do not recommend leaving the ferns on over the winter. And the reason we don't recommend that is because there's an insect called an asparagus beetle that's on your handout actually that can damage asparagus, and it hangs out in the leftover ferns over the winter. So once you see those ferns turn yellow in the fall, like in this picture, that's the time to go ahead and remove them. If you have a burn pile or something, you can put them in the burn pile. I don't really recommend putting them in your compost pile because if they do have asparagus beetles, those beetles will just live in your compost pile over the winter. And in November, it's kind of too late in the season for a compost pile to really break down too much. All right, so like I said earlier, asparagus is really good for reducing tillage. You don't have to till very much in an asparagus system. You can use cover crops or clover row cover between your asparagus rows. And it has living roots all year round. Even though the plants are dormant, those roots are alive during the winter, and they're allowing kind of a community for microbes and other important organisms in the soil. So this is a great crop for increasing soil health. All right, so in conventional asparagus fields, let's say in Michigan, where they're producing about a third of the world, or a third of the country's asparagus, they are actually tilling their fields a lot. Between the rows, you'll see no row cover or anything, and they'll till in the spring before the asparagus comes up, which is risky because you might hurt the ferns that are about to come up. But they do it carefully so that they can incorporate fertilizer. On a garden scale, I do not recommend doing this at all. I recommend just not tilling or cultivating at all in the spring and letting your spears grow. And then you might cultivate after the spears are done growing at the end of harvest, but it's usually not necessary to do so, again, unless you want to incorporate a little compost. Here are some of the advantages of not tilling versus tilling. There's been actually quite a bit of research on this about whether or not you should till in the spring or in the fall for asparagus. And what the research is showing is that it's typically better, for a lot of reasons, just to not till. People who didn't till their asparagus had better crowns, they had better yield, better bud growth, which means that your asparagus patch is expanding every year than when they tilled every year. So just go ahead and in the spring, just don't touch it and let your spears come up is what I would recommend. This is what, if you plant a cover crop between your rows, this is what that might look like. And this is a large asparagus farm down in southern Minnesota. But he's got a grass cover crop on each side of his asparagus row. And this, one of the big benefits of this is when you're trying to harvest asparagus, you have to get in there and harvest, even if the ground is really wet. And if it's rained a lot, it's going to be hard to get in there. But if you have a grass or clover ground cover planted in between there, it's going to be a lot easier to walk on that soil, even if it is really wet. So I do recommend considering a row cover or a grass cover crop for that. So it also helps outcompete weeds. There are a lot of weeds like thistles that are issues in perennial systems like this where we're not disturbing it a lot. And so if you have a ground cover that you plant it, will help outcompete those weeds. It's a really good idea. So the cover crop would need to be established in the first year, or if you already have an asparagus patch at home, you could establish that cover crop anytime you want. So a lot of the times these are perennial cover crops, like white Dutch clover or a fescue grass that you just plant once and then just maintain it and mow it periodically throughout the season. But sometimes people will plant annual cover crops between their rows as well. And that would be something like a red clover, Austrian peas, or like a cereal rye is one that you hear a lot about. And that's something where you would need to plant it every year, and then it dies over the winter, or it'll overwinter and die in the spring. So those are just a couple of things to consider. There was one study that said that if you plant a row cover between your rows, it could reduce the yield of your asparagus by about 25 to 50%. That's not always going to happen. It's just that sometimes the cover crop does compete with the asparagus if you actually let it crawl into your asparagus rows. So here is a list of the options that I would recommend if you're interested in trying some cover crops. As far as perennial cover crops, fescues, like hard fescue, typically grow pretty well here. Bluegrass is another one that you might try. It might not survive the winter, but often it does. And then Dutch white clover for a legume to add some nitrogen and good organic matter to that soil. The perennials, the pros of these are that they're really low maintenance. You typically only have to plant them once, and then they're good to go for a long time. They protect the soil from foot traffic like I talked about before, but they are pretty slow to establish. So if you plant a perennial cover crop, don't expect a huge stand in the first year. It might take a couple of years. And with annual cover crops, you have to replant them annually, every year. But they're kind of nice because they grow really, really quickly. And so once they die, they turn into a really nice thick mulch on the ground. And then so you can use that mulch to walk over as well. So they outcompete weeds a lot better than some of the perennial cover crops do. Rye, Sudan grass, buckwheat, and tillage radish are some of those annual cover crops that we recommend. I know that this picture on the right is not asparagus, but I just wanted to show you an example of if you plant a perennial white clover in between your asparagus rows, that's kind of what it's going to look like. It's really low growing, and you might have to mow it every once in a while, but it shouldn't grow more than 8 to 10 inches tall. This picture in the middle, this is Sudan grass on the right. It grows to 6 feet tall. It's a very tall grass. And this one in the same picture but on the left, that's buckwheat. So buckwheat is a cover crop that has about a 1-month life cycle. So if you plant it in June, it grows really, really quick, and then it's done growing by about the middle of July. Whereas Sudan grass, if you plant that in June, it'll take about 2.5 months until it grows to 6 feet, and you'll want to mow it down at that point. But you can also mow it down sooner if you don't want a 6-foot stand of Sudan grass in your field. So this is just another example of cover crop growing between the asparagus rows. In this case, some of those weeds did get in the middle of the row, like those dandelions there. But he's got the cover crop out competing those weeds between the rows, so then he can just focus his energy on weeding in the row. All right, so I'll do a couple of questions about asparagus now if anybody has questions, and we'll go on to garlic. All right, no questions. So garlic, it sounded like a couple of people in here planted garlic, but not too many. There's a lot of really great varieties of garlic that we can grow in Minnesota. A lot of the time when you go to the grocery store, the garlic that's there is just one white variety, and that's usually from California or another warmer state. And it's actually a variety that we don't grow in Minnesota because it's not hardy enough here. And that's called softneck garlic. What we grow here that's hardy enough is called hardneck garlic. So they're just different types of varieties. And a lot of these, since you don't find them in grocery stores, they're considered specialty or more rare. So that can also be neat. They all have slightly different flavors and characteristics to them. So we have an opportunity, I would say, to grow a lot of really unique varieties. I'll also say there are a number of garlic farms in Minnesota that specialize in that. And so you might see those farms around at farmers markets, and they've been doing a really good job over the past few years increasing the diversity of garlic varieties that we're growing in the state. This is what a Hartnett garlic looks like. As you see, this has been harvested, but it still has its neck attached, and it is what it sounds like. It's just a really hard neck. That's what it looks like when it's growing. So one basically hard stem with some leaves coming out of the sides. Whereas this is a soft neck variety, and when you get it in the store, since it was a soft neck, that neck gets cut off. And it looks similar, but this neck will often be soft enough to kind of keel over a little bit. But don't worry about the soft hardnecks too much because we can't grow them that well here in Minnesota. So hardnecks are cold hardy. They all vary quite a bit in the number of cloves they have per head. Some of these varieties will have like 9 or 10 cloves in one head. Some of them will just have 4 or 5. And a lot of them are smaller bulbs as well. So if you're thinking about how much you cook with garlic over the year, I would consider planting more than you might think because a lot of those heads are a lot smaller than we're used to getting in the store. When purchasing garlic seed, seeds are the cloves. And so one clove that you plant will end up as one head of garlic. They can be kind of pricey, the seeds can. Let's say if you wanted to plant between 40 and 60 cloves, basically, that's going to be between $20 and $30. So that's about a pound of garlic seed. But just think like if you really want 60 heads of garlic to use over the year, you'd be buying about a pound of seed garlic, which is just a pound of cloves. There are a couple of white skin varieties that we recommend for Minnesota. One of these is called German white porcelain. It grows really well here. It has large uniform cloves. As you can see, this picture here is just a couple of heads of garlic that have been cut into, and this is pretty typical for the German white porcelain variety, just 5 really uniform cloves in there. Personally, that's what I like because when I'm cooking, I don't like to have to prepare a ton of tiny little cloves. I like them to be big and uniform. This one on the right is a variety called Georgia Fire, and it has about 6 cloves per bulb. It's still fairly uniform, as you can see, and it has a rich flavor. I would say that typically your German white porcelain is going to be a larger, more uniform clove than the Georgia Fire, but both of them will typically grow very well in our area. There are several purple skin varieties of hardneck that grow well here, and those are shown here. So the first one to the left is called Music. And Music has a pretty strong flavor to it. So when I say strong flavor, I'm typically talking about almost a hot, spicy flavor to it. Not like a hot chili pepper, but you definitely feel it if you eat a lot of it. And then the Deerfield Purple, the one in the middle, is more of a mild, spicy flavor, so not quite as strong as the Music. With the Siberian Purple Stripe, that's a sweeter variety. And the other thing to note with these is the number of cloves per head and the variability in size. So again, something important to me is uniformity in each head. The Deerfield Purple has anywhere between 9 to 11 cloves per head. So if you see that clove there, that head there, it's not very large, which means that you have some really large cloves in that head and some really small ones, so it's just not as uniform. Whereas the Music variety, that's going to be more uniform with just fewer cloves per head. The Siberian is another one that has kind of variable bulb size or head size, so it's hard to know how many cloves per head you might get with that variety. But they're all very nice. If you do sell at a farmer's market, they're really attractive to farmer's market customers. The purple in the skin, of course, does not translate to the color of the actual clove. The purple is just in that skin. Planting garlic is pretty simple. There's not a whole lot to say about that, but it's planted in October, and so typically, on a garlic farm, they're harvesting their garlic in July, and then they're drying it and saving it, and then planting some of the cloves from that garlic the following October. Seed garlic, which is the type that you buy, it's typically the largest cloves per head when they're harvested, because a large garlic clove will end up being a larger, more healthy garlic plant and garlic bulb the next year. So what you want to do is, if you're currently growing garlic and you want to save your garlic for seed for next year, you actually want to save the largest cloves to plant for later. So they are planted about 6-inch spacing. In this instance, he actually dug just a very narrow trench with a hoe and planted into that, and then he would go and backfill that soil over the garlic cloves, just leaving this very tip here. If you can see my red pointer in the middle to the left of his hand. Just this very tip that goes up would be exposed out of the soil. But you actually don't need to dig that trench if you don't want to. If your soil is soft enough, you can just go ahead and poke the garlic cloves into the soil and that'll be fine. This is what the seed looks like. And so this is just a picture. A lot of these farms will have friends come out and help them plant because it all needs to be done in October, between harvesting other crops and before it gets too cold. So they'll often ask their friends to come out and help. So this is just a picture of a larger garlic planting. What they're doing here is they're not just doing each row spaced the same amount apart. What they're doing is planting them in beds. So their beds, if you can see from here to here, they're about 2 inches wide. And within each bed, they're planting 4 rows of garlic close together. So you can do that if you want. The rows are within that bed are spaced about 3 or 4 inches apart. So that's a pretty compact garlic planting. But you can also just plant individual rows of garlic maybe 6 inches apart or something like that. But the advantage of doing it in beds like this and planting 4 rows close together, then leaving space is if you want to plant a lot of garlic, you then have space to walk in between there. And so then after you plant in October, it's typically a good idea to water that. Unless there is some rain coming, then you could just use the natural rain to water it. It doesn't need a ton in the fall. Once it starts freezing outside, make sure you don't keep watering it because that water will freeze and kind of impact the bulbs. So we don't want that. In the spring, a lot of folks will use mulch. And part of the reason is just to block out weeds. And then so they'll put on mulch in the spring and then take that mulch off once the bulbs actually start to grow. But mulch also cools the soil. And so that's another kind of disadvantage of it, is that the soil is cooler, the garlic is going to come up more slowly. So some people will actually, if they already have it on in the spring, they'll take it off for a couple of weeks once the temperatures start getting warm to let that soil warm, and then they'll put the mulch back on. So that is an option if you're interested in using mulch in your garlic, because it is a really nice weed suppressant, especially during the season. So that's what garlic would look like after a few weeks in the spring. You can just see it's coming up really nicely through that mulch. So in June, the garlic will start developing scapes. And these are these kind of curly cues on the tops of the garlic plants. Those scapes are edible. So a lot of people will actually come and harvest those scapes off and either eat them or sell them. Okay. But others will just throw them away. You want to take the garlic scapes off, whether you're going to eat them or throw them away or give them to your neighbor, because they take a lot of energy from the plant, and if the plant's focusing its energy on growing that scape on the top, it's less energy for the bulb. So take those off and do whatever you may with them. There's a picture of people coming out and harvesting those garlic scapes to actually sell at the farmer's market. Garlic is harvested in July, typically, and so when you harvest it is determined by what the stem of the plant looks like. Once the stem of the plant starts turning brown like this towards the bottom, and you can see those bottom leaves shriveling up and turning brown, that is the time to harvest your garlic. So you can just take a couple bulbs out, make sure they look okay, and go ahead and do your harvest then, because once this bottom of the stem starts turning brown, they're not going to keep enlarging. There's no more water getting up to the stems at that point. Garlic can be stored something like this if you have a lot of it. So the main idea is you want to create an airy environment that the garlic can dry in. You don't want it rotting when it's being stored. And so that's why a lot of people will hang their garlic in like something like an outbuilding where the air can get through there, and they'll let it dry there for several weeks. And then they will take it down, and they'll either harvest what they want, and the rest of it they'll use for seed. So this is Jerry Ford. He is a member of the Sustainable Farming Association. He also grows garlic, and he leads a lot of garlic workshops throughout the state with farmers. So that is how he chooses to dry his garlic. But if you don't have something like that, you can always just, if you just have a small amount, you can set it out on your counter or something like that. But just make sure it has a lot of air to dry. Garlic bloat nematode is a nematode that's a big problem for garlic. It feeds, as you can see, on the bulbs. And this is a pest that we consider to be a big problem. And so a lot of these garlic supply companies who are selling to others will get their garlic tested for garlic bloat nematode before they're actually sold. Because we really don't want this nematode spreading throughout Minnesota or throughout the Midwest. So this is something where when you're buying garlic, you might just check and see if it's been checked for garlic bloat nematode, and a lot of the times it will have been. But if you ever see this happening in your garden, you'll want to consider just taking that out, throwing it away, and you can send it to a disease lab at the university, or you can email me and we can get that checked for you. Fusarium is another disease that's more common on garlic. Here is what it looks like. This looks like it's just a dirty clove, but it actually has some fungal spores growing on the outside of it. So it's safe to eat, it's fine. You'll just want to remove those from the field and don't plant any seed garlic from any bulbs that had fusarium on them. So it's just kind of a black spore growth on the skin of the clove. All right, so just to review a few points about garlic. So hardneck varieties are the types that we recommend for Minnesota. Softneck are just not quite hardy enough here. Plant in October, and then harvest the next June or July. And then plant by just poking them into the soil, or if you just want to mark your row by digging with a hoe a little bit and backfilling that soil on top of them, that's okay. Just make sure the top of the clove is sticking up above the soil. And then after harvest, just hang those to dry. All right, so got about 5 minutes for questions.
Can you,
Sorry, I had one in the back first, and then I'll up here.
Western Minnesota, any time to plant in October or early, mid, or late?
Typically anytime in October, just watch the weather. You want to make sure it has 3 weeks or so to grow before a lot of the frost starts coming on. But if there's 1 frost, 2 frosts, it's typically okay. I had one question up here first.
Are you familiar with the Main Street project and the garlic they're growing with chicken manure they're showing really large bulbs?
I happen to be familiar with that because I sat next to that guy at a conference last winter. So I think they just let their chickens go through the plots at some points during the year, and then they also use the chicken manure in the plots. Is that your understanding as well?
Correct.
Yeah, so chicken manure is really, really high in nutrients, especially nitrogen, and garlic, just like any vegetable, requires these nutrients, so I can see how putting that chicken manure in lets them have some really good vegetables. With manure, it's very, very, very important that you're not applying manure several months between when you put it on and when you harvest. It's a major food safety risk. So if you're going to put on manure, I would do that the fall before you're going to harvest. And that goes for any vegetable. It's safest just to avoid fresh manure, period, and just use composted manure if that's something that you have access to. I think, yeah, you have a question? Yeah.
I have a question about asparagus, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
You said to build a windbreak like with trees and stuff, so does that mean it can grow in shade or sun?
No, it can't grow in the shade. Yeah, it has to be full sun. It's just, if you're on a really windy site and you could plant it maybe 30 feet out from your house or something and use your house as a windbreak, that's a good idea. Yeah, the reason is, especially with sandy soil, if there's a lot of wind, those soil particles, or even though we don't see it, they're hitting up against the spears, and in asparagus, it happens to be one of the biggest ways that diseases get into our asparagus. And once the diseases are there, they're not going anywhere since it's a perennial. So that's why we stress the windbreak thing with asparagus. You had a question in the back?
Well, I just had a question about varieties. Jerry Ford that you alluded to, I know I've heard him speak, and he suggested the variety porcelain music. Now, is that just a white version of the purple, or the purple?
My understanding is that it's the same thing, and music is just a short name from porcelain music.
Oh, okay.
Because
that's-
porcelain is like a type of variety, there's
Yeah.
several different
Mhm.
porcelain varieties.
Okay.
I think it should be the same one. Yeah.
Does it hurt to burn your asparagus off in the spring before the spears come up?
Burn down meaning with an herbicide or physically burning?
Physically burning?
So you would be burning the ferns then?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just risky in the case that the spears are starting to come up, you know, if they're within about an inch of the soil surface, I think that might, cause some
A lot of
scorching.
dandelions in mine, so I was just,
Okay, yeah, I mean, you could try it on a small amount, how much do you have?
it's about a 20 by 30 spot.
A 20 by 30, so, yeah, I just think it would be risky since those spears are just hanging out so close to the soil surface. You could always try it on, I guess, a corner and see what happens though. Into that first and then I'll come up here.
In the spring, I've seen garlic cloves at greenhouses or nurseries. Is that hardneck, softneck? Can they be planted in spring and develop into anything?
You could, but I wouldn't really recommend doing it in spring. You know, it's possible, but it really likes to overwinter in order to truly develop. So if you planted it in spring, what would probably happen is it'll just grow throughout the summer and then you might get some cloves in fall. But when I have tried that in the past, I didn't get cloves in the fall. It had to overwinter and still took until the next year. As far as garden centers, I guess it just depends on the garden center. A lot of them in Minnesota at this point should be moving towards the hardneck varieties because there's been a big increase in education about that. But just ask them when you go and see. You had a question too?
You did mention herbicides, which,
Right.
I can appreciate them, and I use them.
Okay.
And, is it okay to use Roundup before the little guys come up in the spring?
Yes.
And, or, Princep?
Princep, I'm not sure about. I know that it's okay if you use Roundup. That's something that's labeled for asparagus, so as long as you're using it before you see anything actually coming up, that should be fine. And then you can also use it after you finish harvesting, because when you harvest, you want to make sure you're harvesting all the spears, and so then you can apply Roundup again.
So you mentioned, cutting the ferns of the asparagus in the fall. What if they're cut prior to them turning? For an example,
Yeah.
my dad took the lawnmower to it.
Okay.
What are the odds of things actually coming back in a healthy manner?
They'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just, they'll be a little bit slower,
Okay.
probably, because what the plant is doing when it turns brown is it's putting all the sugars and energy back into the roots to store over the winter. So it'll just be a little bit hungrier all winter, a little bit starved, so to speak. It'll still come back up. It won't be devastating or
So
anything.
recommending maybe a little bit of phosphorus though, or?
Yeah, some nutrients just to help it out would be a good idea. Some like a balanced fertilizer. If you ever look at a fertilizer bag at a garden center, it's got a series of 3 numbers. It's usually like 10, 15, 10. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So just a balanced one would be a good idea to help it out there. I did have a farmer in southern Minnesota who said the same thing. His ferns never turned brown in time to cut them off before the winter. And so in that case, he did decide to leave them on until the next spring. And it just means that there's more risk of insects overwintering, but in that case, you can use an insecticide if that is something that you're doing to help with the asparagus beetles that are probably in those.
Well, we probably mowed them off, it was like in August, so
In
before
August?
you even
Okay.
had like a chance.
It's a little early.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what's gonna happen.
Okay.
Thought I'd ask.
Did they come up after that at all, or was that it?
There was maybe a little bit of growth, but
Okay.
they were really young, like super
Oh.
young.
Right. Yeah, if they were really young, definitely use some fertilizer. And you might tell him not to harvest as many spears the next year.
Okay.
Because he might be planning to harvest for 6 weeks or so. Try to ask him to harvest for maybe 3 weeks
Okay.
at most.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you say anything Does it require mulching for winter? Like you plant it in, fall and October, should it be mulched or not mulched for winter?
So it doesn't have to be or not have to be, it can, and it won't really do any harm to mulch it. So one recommendation is garlic is what you're talking about. So you plant the garlic, you put down mulch in about October, you leave the mulch on during the winter, and then you would take it off once the snow melts around this point in the year, let the soil warm, and then you can re-mulch and put that back on. But you don't have to. Its main benefit during the winter is just weed control, and that's it. Any other, yeah?
Okay, so I must have had the female variety somewhere, because I have
Okay.
ones coming up all over my yard. But they're no good for eating radish, I just,
The female ones,
well, the little ones coming up all over my yard.
they'll produce asparagus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My flower bed has asparagus now, of course,
Mhm.
which is fine.
It might not end up having the variety characteristics that you want, but it will produce some asparagus.
Yeah,
So.
they have been, some, the ones I
Okay.
know have been, yes.
Okay.
They're kind of pretty.
Yeah. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes if anyone else wants to chat about anything. Oh, I have to do a plug for our newsletter. So you might get the Yard and Garden news already, but we have a new newsletter that's specifically fruits and vegetables that I started about a year ago. And so it's called Fruit and Vegetable News. It's through the University of Minnesota, of course. And it's just one monthly email. And we'll have articles about all kinds of things, like recommendations, new videos that we put out,